Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 13 of B-Road Ballers, the review series of course for the hot hatches large and small of GT6. And in this episode we're featuring quite a popular little car. It's one of the smaller hot hatches, also one of the slightly less powerful than more obvious choices like the Megane or the Focus or the Golf. And it is of course the Peugeot 106. Now there are two versions of this car on the game, both of which are pretty popular. There's this version, which is the S16, and there's the Rallye version. Now the Rallye version is slightly lighter, slightly more inclined towards cornering, whereas the S16 is slightly quicker in a straight line. Both though, as I said, are very popular. And cars like this do tend to have quite a cult following. And I think much of that is probably based on real life as well, from people knowing friends who've had cars like this and really enjoying being in them or being the driver of them. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of small hot hatches. I can understand the appeal, I'm just not that much of a fan of them. I prefer stuff like the Megane or the Golf, more large, more powerful hot hatches. But small hot hatches such as the 106 or the Starlet, etc., they definitely do have their advantages. The two primary advantages of them is of course the weight and the size. They're very compact, very chuckable through the corners. You can throw them through the corners and really dominate tracks where you don't have much room for overtaking, such as city tracks. Now this particular model is a 1.6 litre turbo, it's front wheel drive, fairly obviously, and it produces pretty decent specs for a relatively small engine. It produces 283 brake horsepower, and that's quite a rev-happy engine. Peak power is 8,000, and it produces what I found a slightly surprising 210 pound-feet of torque, which is more than I would have thought. I would have expected maybe 170 or 180 pound-feet, so pretty decent. It only weighs 839 kilos, probably not too surprising there, and thanks to that low weight combined with its pretty decent power output, it has just that, a decent power to weight ratio per tonne of 337, which isn't leading in its class, but it's definitely not bad. The PP as well, I would say, is pretty well placed on this model, not quite as low as some of the other small hot hatches, but at the same time not as high as some of the more obvious choices like the Focus. It sits at 494 pp fully tuned. And although I wouldn't necessarily recommend racing it at that level, because at the end of the day, at the 500 pp level or just under, you can get some pretty powerful and fast cars at that level, be it muscle cars or imports. And this car isn't really going to be able to keep up with those for the most part on tracks that require more straight line speed. On twisty tracks, of course, it would stand a chance, but there aren't that many twisty tracks on the game where this car can really outshine anything at the 500 pp level. There may be one or two like Monaco, but in general not really. Even tracks like the Nürburgring, where this car would do very well, still has quite a high average speed requirement that this car would struggle to keep at in relation to something like an Impreza or a Dodge Charger. The PP that I would recommend using it at, well, I don't actually race small hot hatches that much, but I'd probably recommend something between the 425 and 475 pp region, because around that level none of the cars that you use are allowed to have a huge amount of power, unless of course it's the Jay Leno tank car, which doesn't really count. And so any advantage that your opponents may have is kind of neutralised. So then you can really use that handling and the low weight really to your advantage. Now, as is the case with many of these small hot hatches, the value for money on this car is very good. It costs just over 18,000 credits, so it's very cheap. In terms of performance in the overall hot hatch class, for any size hot hatch, it's not exactly a worry for something like a Megane RS or a Clio V6 or something like that. Again, on some tracks it might be able to keep up, but overall it's not much of a challenger for those cars. It just doesn't have the straight line power. Within its class though, the small hot hatch category, with around 300 or less horsepower fully tuned, it's a very good model to go for, and the fact that so many people love driving it and win races with it attests to that. So it's a pretty decent alternative to some of the more obvious choices in the hot hatch category, and it certainly holds its own against many of them. One thing to note about the car though, not necessarily a bad thing, but just something that slightly surprised me, is that the handling has a little bit more understeer than I would have expected. Commonly these very small front-wheel drive hot hatches are extremely nimble. Now this car is nimble and the handling is good, but it's a little bit heavier, even with no camber, than some of the other front-wheel drive hot hatches, so that's something to bear in mind on some tracks. But overall it doesn't impede it that much. So that's it for this episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.